That one glorious word represents more than just the geography between the Sabine and the Rio Grande. It represents a unique idea and way of life. A life of rugged individualism, proud self-reliance, gritty toughness, and fierce independence. That is what made Texas, and that is what will save her again. Howdy, folks. Sam Houston here. I want to thank you for tuning into the Feed Bandit podcast. Feed Bandit is the Texas first outdoors brand built by rabid Texans, for rabid Texans, and all those who aim to be one someday. We unapologetically promote the ideals that shape our Texas pride and Texas first patriotism through our love of hunting, the outdoors, and the gear and apparel we create. Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Check us out at feedbandit.com. And to repeat that great rallying cry from a former colleague of mine, liberty or death. Now, enough of my talking. Here are a couple of bandits that love Texas as much as I do. Enjoy.
Howdy, friend. Welcome back to the Feed Bandit podcast. Jimmy back with you. And on this one, we're going to do a little story hour. And this is a story called Spirit of the North. It's written by Tom Paw, who was, I guess, the editor of Field and Stream back in the 90s. And this one is about something we don't talk about too much, or really ever, here on the Feed Bandit podcast, considering we do talk a lot about Texas hunting. But, you know, you never know. Maybe in the hill country there's one of these. I don't highly doubt it, but it's possible, I guess. There are elk. This one is about moose, and particularly moose in Canada. I hope you enjoy it. In the tent, the hunters come and go, talking of the Windigo, although Windigos would probably be among the very last thing anybody would care to talk about in the moose country of the north. Moose country is by nature the most remote of all hunting countries we may ever experience. This moose country, experienced in mid-September, was the world's largest swamp, the Hudson Bay lowlands of Manitoba, Canada. To be precise, it lay along the course of the Big Stone River, the Big Stone a tributary of the Fox, and the Fox a tributary of the Hayes. These rivers were once part of a famous fur trading route, the Middle Track, that ran 570 miles from the pass in the interior out to the bay at York Factory, which for the 2.5 centuries that it was a Hudson's Bay Company post was the capital of the northern fur trade. Though the fur trade continues, the days of the great bundle-laden birch bark canoes transporting the season's pelts are long past, and now the only canoes you are likely to meet on these waters are those of such individuals as my hunting companions, Gren and Harold, who each September venture into this back country to paddle along and hunt moose. Yet even with 2 other individuals present, friendly individuals with considerable bush sense to boot, I still could never be certain what kind of hearts they might have. This could, quite justifiably, make one feel like the last human alive, especially while hunting moose and worrying about the Windigo in a distant wilderness like this. The remoteness of moose country is not contingent upon how far away from everywhere else it may be. Caribou and muskox country, for instance, can be a much more distant place. But the tundra spaces the caribou click across in their vast herds are usually wide open ones, and in their way rather pleasant, making caribou the plains game of the north, and putting one in mind of other sunlighted Pleistocene expanses with names like Serengeti. For the moose's part, he quite often abides in dense willow thickets and spruce jungles of almost oppressive darkness and damp. In such locales, the moose, who unlike the caribou is definitely not a herd animal, can seem as solitary as a tiger. In moose country, entire days can go by with hunters never seeing a single one of the animals they are in pursuit of, and without seeing another member of their own species either. This was precisely the sort of circumstance in which I found myself as I hunted by canoe on the Big Stone with Gren and Harold. It was the time of the rut for the moose. At first light on a typical hunting day, Grin and I might paddle the big aluminum canoe a mile or more upstream from camp on the fog-wooled river, breaching it on a muddy bank where there would be the deep hoof prints of a moose who had swum the river and moved on into the bush. We would hunker on the canoe thwarts then and wait for long, plaintive, early morning grunting of a cow moose to break the silence, to be answered by the equally low, short, harsh grunting of a bull. Grin, cupping his hands around his mouth and pinching close to his nostrils with his index fingers, would imitate these grunts and listen for a response. Yet even when his call did receive an answer, there was no guarantee that a moose would appear. After an hour or two of shivering, we would paddle back to camp, where Harold would have piping bowls of Red River cereal awaiting us. With breakfast eaten, we would head out onto the river again, covering as much of the remote territory as we could, hoping to catch a moose when he stepped out onto the shore to leave his tracks once more in the mud. The landscape in that season was patched by the yellow of willows as their leaves turned, seemingly before our eyes. Almost as soon as we paddled past a clump of shimmering green bush, it would begin to blaze like the top of some octogenarian's birthday cake. While the needles of the tamaracks died off in their own fiery yellow manner, the always dark spruces stood reservedly back from it all, looking down on the spectacle of deciduousness and having none of it. As the canoe glided noiselessly through the water, faster than a man could jog along the shore, we could slip up on beavers the dimensions of clumber spaniels, who had constructed stick houses the dimensions of palazzos. The huge rodents, humped up on the shore, gnawing at lengths of poplar, would stare at us pig-eyed as we drew near, before waddling into the river. They would cut a clean V through the water as they swam, eyeing the canoe's approaching prow with suspicion, then dive, slapping their flat hairless tails on the surface as loudly as someone doing a belly flop off a springboard. Looking down into the clear flow, you might catch sight of them torpedoing slightly past, as if in the fantasy of some voyager from York Factory's first days. We would see Canada geese ahead of us, their heads rising alertly on their long necks as we hove into view. Then the ludicrous honking would begin as we approached, concluding with flapping sprints across the river and boisterous liftoffs. Ducks followed suit. Bald eagles, already airborne, demonstrated a different technique to show us we were not to be trusted, gaining altitude over the river above us by kicking downward with their taloned feet as their wings pulled them upward. Minks, who must surely possess brains no larger than the tip of a finger, were as erratic as pinballs, first swimming away from us, then zigzagging directly back at us, then diving under us at the last instant. The river otters, on the other hand, would tread water and watch us curiously, but with transcendent indifference, while making a purring hum. On one occasion, we even spotted a fisher, big as a house cat, with a cat's long tail, standing on the bedrock shore, bobbing his open-mouthed head in weasel fashion before turning and slipping away from our sight. Nonetheless, it was moose we were after, and moose we would be thinking about as we paddled back in at night, with the moon bright as a street lamp behind us. The water was satin beneath the moon, and the paddle would dip into it with a tearing sound as it was pulled, spraying drops in a pearled arc as it was lifted out, only to be dipped in again in the seemingly endless cycle of paddling that made up our day until we were back at the lantern-lit camp. In the tent, heated at night by the airtight wood stove, I would still be thinking of moose while Grin and Harold read about famous battles and military heroes. Eventually, they would mark the pages in their books and set up their cots to tell me about the Windigo again. Even today, in the Hudson Bay lowlands, the Windigo is as tangible and frightening to the Ojibwa and Cree as Jeffrey Dahmer is to us. The Windigo often takes the form of a 10-foot giant, and though he breathes fire, his heart is a ball of solid ice. He flies through the air at night, looking for lone humans so he can commit that still most heinous of all crimes, cannibalism, surviving on a diet of his victim's flesh and blood. A shaman, with the aid of other spirits, has a chance of killing a Windigo, but for an ordinary man the task is nearly impossible. If he should manage to cut off the Windigo's head, that head will only reunite with the monstrous body. Any bullet other than a silver one would be useless against him. A human bitten by a Windigo would unavoidably become one, and simply dreaming of the creature can affect the transformation. Finishing their nightly recitation of the tale of the Windigo, Gren and Harold would turn off the lantern, and in the faltering glow of the mantle would both wish me pleasant dreams. In the morning, none of us apparently having been devoured or transformed in the night, we would be out after moose once more. Canoeing for game was something of a novel experience for me, with its own set of rules to be memorized. First, there was a necessity of absolute silence. Sounds seemed to travel an infinite distance across the water, so speech could never rise above a whisper. Then there was the problem of banging a paddle against the hull, the resulting sound to our ears approximating the bells of Notre Dame. Early on in the hunt, I had learned how to paddle, leaning back with each stroke, rather than tiring myself by pulling with my arms alone, without letting the paddle touch the gunwale. If we ever spotted a moose while I was paddling in my bow seat, I was not to worry about trying to place my paddle back into the canoe, but was simply to lay it gently on the water where it would float and get my rifle ready. In this part of Manitoba, it was legal to hunt from a canoe as long as it was not being powered by a motor. Finally, there was the problem I had with right and left. When we came to whitewater, we had several options. In many places, we would get out and portage the canoe around the rapids. In others, we might try to line it up or downriver. This entailed our hopping from rock to rock instead of the canoe, holding a rope tied to it and pulling it through like packers leading a mule through a place on the trail. But wherever the water permitted, we decided that honor demanded we paddle our way through. As we would approach whitewater, Gren and Harold, when I was hunting with him, would outline the upcoming campaign for me. Right now at Radio Rapids, the instructions would begin, or, if we have to go through Antler Rapids. Where do those names come from? I asked, instinctively regretting the question about as soon as it left my lips. Well, Gren or Harold would reply, studiously avoiding eye contact. Radio Rapids is where we turned over the canoe one year and lost the radio. In Antler Rapids... ... But enough of that, he would say, and quickly go on to explain that at the next stretch of whitewater, I would have to pull hard to the right or left as per his shouted command to keep us heading straight. Then we would be racing through the rapids, always much sooner than I anticipated, and I would hear "right" from behind me and begin to paddle furiously. "Right, right," would come the shout again, and I knew I was paddling on the wrong side and would hastily switch. After one such rock-banging run, Harold asked me the question I had been dreading. "You don't have some sort of trouble with right and left, do you?" he asked mildly. I slumped visibly. One of the darkest secrets of my life had been revealed, because, truth to tell, I had never had the damnedest idea which was right or left. It was a long story about being born left-handed and being made right-handed, more or less. The end result was a form of dyslexia in which my right hand not only never knew what my left was up to, it didn't even know it was my right. Harold listened in silence, and after a moment of thought, merely nodded. At the next set of rapids, I sat taut as a fence wire, hoping I could respond properly this time to the command, so there would not be a Tom Rapids or a Mercantile Maelstrom added to the map. As we started into the chute of boiling water, I was waiting for the indecipherable shout of right, when instead I heard Harold shouting, "Rifle side!" We sailed through as delicately as a fallen leaf. Yet in spite of several 10 and 12-hour days of canoeing on the Big Stone, we had, with the exception of one cow and her calf, yet to see a moose, and it was hard not to feel the deep lonesomeness of moose country when the object of your pursuit cannot be seen. I could feel the lonesomeness most when we would stand by a tumble-down trapper's cabin on the bank, where a man would have wintered in a low, windowless room, supplied with tea, flour, baking powder, and salt, 2-pound tins of Rogers Golden Syrup, and 17-cent ones of club chewing tobacco, and whatever his rifle, traps, fishing line, nets, and berry bucket might provide, without the sound of a human voice other than his own from freezing up to spring thaw, and with thoughts of the Windigo becoming all too real. I think even Harold and Gren, far more used to moose country than I, were feeling it too in their own ways. On one of the last days, all three of us were out in the canoe together. In the distance we heard a plane, and I remembered that it had been over a week since I had last heard one. Harold, keen student of military history that he was, lifted his paddle from the water and squinted skyward. "What do you think, Grindle?" I heard him ask. "Cargo plane? Or," he brightened noticeably, "maybe a heavy bomber coming to put us out of our misery by dropping 500-pound women on us?" They both laughed, and so did I. Then the thought, did I actually hear him say Grindle? Stopped me in mid-guffaw. I listened then to their laughter and wondered if Windigos sounded like that. In spite of the lonesomeness, there were still moose to be found in this country, but like so many other wild animals, they are to be found mostly on their own terms. A day before we were scheduled to fly out, Harold and I made one of our long moose hunting circuits around the river. After a day of paddling, portaging, and running rapids, of driving and still hunting through the nearly impenetrable mossy-floored stands of timber and tall willows, we found our way back to the last bend above camp. For an hour we sat while Harold called. It was nearing last light, and cloud cover had moved in to turn the day gray and misty. If this was not a Windigo weather, then I didn't know what was. Having heard no answer to Harold's calling, we finally decided to make our way back to camp. We were 500 or 600 yards downriver when we heard the loud, splashing, boggy sound from the shore behind us. I had no idea what could make such a sound, but as we turned the canoe back upriver, I was wishing I had a few 300-grain silver bullets to complement the lead and gilding metal ones loaded in my .375. Then, far ahead of us, I could see a small feeder creek that ran into the Big Stone, with a beaver dam across its mouth. From the deep mud behind the dam that he had stumbled through with that loud noise, a perfectly fine bull moose pulled himself onto the bank. He stood a moment, dripping, then walked into the willows, moving upstream along the Big Stone. Every so often a hump of brown fur or the oaken color of a white antler palm could be seen above the yellow leaves, until about 200 yards further the bull walked out onto the open bank and stared across the river to the other side, where several minutes before we had been sitting while Harold called. We were still out of range, but as I hooked my elbows over my knees and watched the bull through my 2.5 X-scope, Harold's soundless paddling drew us incrementally closer. "If he turns and looks at us," Harold whispered, "he'll be gone." Still I waited. We had to get closer to make the shot sure. With agonizing slowness, 500 yards was shrunk to 475, then 450. At 425, the bull turned his giant head toward us, and I could see the wide spread of his antlers. He was still too far. At 400 yards, the bull turned away from us, and the last I saw of him in the slow dying light of the north, having no choice but to let him go, was his heavy haunches as he walked off into the willows and the thick spruces beyond, gone with the Windigo into the most remote country of all. All right. There you have it. I hope you enjoyed that little hunting story, moose hunting story in the big cold north. Of course, sometimes you do everything you can, but you just don't see that trophy animal you've gone for. But the adventure is in the adventure, right? And the harvest at the end, or the harvest during the adventure, is the icing on the cake. All right, well, thank you so much for listening to that story hour. I really appreciate it, and we will catch you on the next one. Remember, support your local feed store. Take care.
Well, I hope the Bandits gave you an interesting episode that either entertained or educated you. Or better yet, both. Hell, I told them this podcasting thing looks harder to do than defeating Santa Anna. So if you would, please help them out by sharing it with all your like-minded friends to help the Bandits get the word out. And don't forget to check us out at feedbandit.com and grab some gear and apparel to support the cause of Texas. Remember, Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Finally, as I said some time ago on the eve of the great battle, and I vigorously repeat here again, be men, be free men, that your children may bless their father's name. Well, fellow bandit, until next time.